I'm John Spritzler, one of the members of People for Democratic Revolution in Boston.
And I'm Abram Spritzler, and I'll be interviewing John Spritzler, my father. Today's topic will be, what is the difference between what we are working for and propose as a society and a process to achieve it? What is different about our way of doing this and our goal, and the goal of socialists, Marxists, and how they achieve it, as well as the goals of liberal activists and how they go about achieving things?
Well, let's start with the Marxists. The Marxists have, as they put it, the goal of a classless society, which is what has attracted millions and millions of people for the last 150 or more years, because that's a good idea. The thing about Karl Marx, though, is that he wasn't just for a classless society. Lots of people were for classless society long before Karl Marx. Going back to the most recent example I stumbled upon recently was the English peasant revolt of 1381, which was for a classless society. What Marx introduced into this conversation about a classless society was what he called his science, the science of Marxism, which was about how supposedly the various laws of economic development would lead pretty much inevitably to a classless society. And that's where the problem with Marxism comes into it, not the goal, but the science. According to the science of Marxism, a classless society will arise because of the workings of the dynamics of capitalism, because of laws that operate because all people pursue their self-interest. The self-interest of people is determined by their relationship to the means of production. So the owners of capital, the capitalists, their self-interest is antagonistic to the self-interest of the workers they employ. One wants higher wages, the other lower. One wants to lower costs by, having working conditions be bad, and the other wants working conditions to be better, which raises costs and lowers profit. So the self-interest of the working class and the capitalist class are in opposition, as Marx points out, and that's certainly true. But the problem with the Marxist science is that it's based on the premise that everybody just simply operates and is motivated by self-interest. What Marxism fails to understand is that the more important reality is that people have different values. There's working class values of equality and concern for one another, sometimes called solidarity and mutual aid. Working class people who reflect this working class culture think that things should be equal and fair, and they think about questions in those terms. That's very opposite to the values of the capitalist ruling class culture, which is a culture that values dominating people. It values inequality. It values competition, or at least pitting people in competition against each other to control them so that the ruling elite can remain in power. These are opposite values, and the Marxists don't recognize this fact at all. If you get into conversations, I have many times with a Marxist, and assert that most working class people have very different values from the capitalists, they deny it. They say, no, it's not true. Everyone's just thinking in terms of self-interest. It's just that what's in the self-interest of one might conflict with what's in the self-interest of the other. Anyway, Marx developed a science that's based on this idea that everyone is pursuing their self-interest. And his science is basically a slight twist on Adam Smith's famous assertion about the invisible hand. It was Adam Smith who said that the baker, the candlestick maker, and so forth, they do what they do out of self-interest, but for reasons that have nothing to do with their subjective intent. The result is good for society in general. People get candlesticks and bread to eat. And so this invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about is the main ideological defense of capitalism, the idea that capitalism is based on self-interest because that supposedly is all that people ever act on, but that in a capitalist system, the invisible hand turns that into, the best of all possible worlds, so to speak. Well, Marx took a slight twist on this and said that no, actually the invisible hand, in other words, this laws of society that have nothing to do with the subjective intentions of people, it causes things to change, and it causes things like capitalist crisis and lowering rate of profit, et cetera, et cetera. You read Capital by Marx and you read all about this, and the important thing about it is that these laws cause the eventual extreme crisis of capitalism that results in its disappearance and replacement by what eventually leads to a classless society, to communism with a small c. So in the Marxist view, the way to get this classless society is not by relying on the fact that people want a classless society consciously and subjectively, that they want equality and so forth. It's actually based on the idea that no, actually most people don't want that. They just think with their belly. They just have what Lenin called trade union consciousness, which means narrow self-interest. The hope for a classless society in the Marxist framework is that these impersonal laws will make it happen in spite of the fact that most working class people do not subjectively want it. And in the Marxist framework, this concept of progressive versus not progressive means that what's progressive is what furthers and quickens the development of these impersonal laws. So, for example, the more the capitalists develop the means of production with big factories and so forth, is considered to be progressive because it increases it hastens the time for the laws to manifest themselves that stem from what happens when people are made to work in large factories and so forth. Okay, so this is the Marxist framework for thinking about social change. As a result of it, the Marxists think that what's important is to somehow persuade people who don't want a classless society to nonetheless follow the leadership of Marxists so that Marxists can come into power and with their expert knowledge of the laws of Marxism, Leninism, to engineer society in such a way that it will eventually become a classless society. One of the things that they have to do, and according to the Marxist view, is to increase economic productivity. The reason being that, according to the Marxist view, and as long as there's economic scarcity, people will not be willing to share things equally with one another. And so the Marxist agenda, when they come in power, is to do whatever it takes to increase productivity. And what they do to increase productivity is to rely on inequality, to use it as a way to motivate people to work harder and so forth. So, Lenin famously used Taylorism, which was the capitalist scientific study of how to get people to work harder. When Lenin was running the show in Russia. So from the Marxist point of view, which is implemented by Lenin, who made it a practical, made it operational. The important thing is for the Marxist, the Communist Party, typically as it's called, to be in power and to make sure that ordinary people are not running the show, because ordinary people only think with their belly and don't have the subjective aim of creating a classless society.
This seems kind of like a catch-22 in that people are declared to be sick, and then the process that cures them will never actually work if they're not actually sick. And there will never be a day when small c communism comes to be, because they aren't sick in the first place, so they can't be cured. So you can never declare them as cured if they weren't sick in the first place. It will have no effect exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine the actual Marxist regimes that have come into power from the famous ones of Russia, and the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party, Albania for a while, and so forth. It's hard to imagine them actually creating an egalitarian classless society. Their practice is veers away from that. Some people point to Cuba. I don't know that much about Cuba, frankly, but what little I know is that people seem to, the large number of Cubans seem to be doing things to make a better society, but I suspect it's in spite of, not because of the Cuban Communist Party, which is basically a dictatorship of the Cuban Communist Party. That anyway, so the practice of Marxism, of Marxists, is to try to persuade working class people to view Marxist and the Communist Party as leaders that they should follow because they're so smart and shrewd and skillful and waging strikes or whatever, and then to willingly let them take power and rule from the top down, as they did in the Soviet Union. Lenin famously said all power to the Soviets, but then took basically all power away from the Soviets and made sure it was firmly in the hands of the Bolshevik Party.
The Soviets were
local assemblies of working people, either based in the factory they worked in or the communities, and then they sent delegates to larger regional Soviets, and if all power had really been in the Soviets, it would have been very democratic, but it was not to be. The Bolshevik Party absolutely did not want that to happen, and made sure it did not happen. So the practice of Marxists and when they're not in power is to try to persuade people to follow them by entering into their struggles and being the best strike organizer or what have you, and never really talking about the conflict of values between the working class values and the capitalist values, because they don't believe that there is such a conflict. And so if they do if they do even talk about revolution, they talk about it as getting their party in power. So, that's the practice of the Marxists. Now, to contrast it with our practice, we understand that there is a conflict of values. That there's working class values that basically it's taking seriously the golden rule. It's taking seriously the idea of concern for one another, of equality, of doing things democratically, treating each other with respect and as equals, versus the capitalist values of treating people like dirt for the benefit of a few. And we talk to people about those values, not to persuade them to have them, but to give them confidence that they're not alone in having them, and that they're very right in having those values. Now, just to go back to the Marxists, especially modern day Marxists, they perceive ordinary people, as not only thinking with their belly and not wanting subjectively a classless society, but actually being dehumanized by capitalism, as they put it, about having terrible values. In the United States, those terrible values are characterized mainly as racism, in the case of white workers, and homophobia, so-called. And the Marxists devote most of their time, actually, to trying to tell people that their values are wrong, and they need to do a 180. They need to turn around and think fundamentally differently than the way they're thinking. Stop being racist, stop being homophobic, and so forth. Whereas our practice, I don't think that that most working class Americans are racist and homophobic. I frankly sympathize greatly with the objections to same-sex marriage, which is for another talk. And I think that where racism is an issue, it should be dealt with on the spot, and challenged. But in my experience, the working people, white working people, try hard not to be racist, and they're making that effort in a context where the ruling class is doing a lot to try to make them think along racist lines. An example of that would be the whole so-called war on drugs, which is basically designed to disproportionately put black men in prison, label them criminals, and then persuade the rest of the population that blacks are a criminal element. Obviously it has some effect, but people try to resist it. The question is, why are they trying to resist it at all? If they're so racist, they wouldn't be resisting it at all, but they do resist it. You can say they might not resist it as well as you'd like, so fine, we should help people resist it better. But the point is that most working class people are trying to make the world better, and it is the values that they're trying to shape, the little corner of the world over which they have any real control, that should shape all of society on a large scale, that are implicitly revolutionary values because they're the opposite of capitalist values. Well, that's how we talk to people. We try to give them confidence. We try to give them confidence that their values are right, that they're not alone in having them, and that they should shape the whole world by those values. The Marxists are busy telling them that they're racist homophobes and wagging their finger at them and telling them to be very different from what they are. So that's the answer to your question, Abram.
So in terms of day-to-day activities, True, you are not in a Marxist or socialist or liberal activist group. You are in the group you're in, but contrast the day-to-day activities as well as and see them and observe them between a socialist organization, a Marxist, a liberal activist group, and yourself. And actually throw in Occupy into the mix on that one.
Well, our practice is, we're a handful of people, so there's a limit to how many different things we can do. So we've picked our priorities, and our priority has been to be out in the streets collecting signatures for the statement "This I Believe," which is a statement that says we should have an egalitarian society, should have laws only made at the local level with voluntary federation to achieve higher region-wide or even global coordination, and that economy should be based on a sharing economy from each according to ability to each according to need, which, as we point out in the statement, is an old idea that can be found even in the New Testament. So it's not like you have to be a Marxist to believe in that idea. Marx just popularized it.
Nor is it that idea will inevitably lead to Marxist or communism.
No, absolutely not. What leads to Marxism and communism is Marxism, not that idea. I mean, Marx also thought that there was gravity and that 2 + 2 is 4. It doesn't mean if you think there's gravity and 2 + 2 is 4 that you become a Marxist. And the statement says that we need a revolution to remove the rich from power to create society the way it ought to be. And we collect signatures for this, and we find that about 75% of the people that read the statement sign it. And then we create large posters, 2 by 3 feet or thereabouts, with the signatures on them, to display to the public, and we take pictures of people who are willing to have their picture taken of people ringing the bell. We have a bell, ringing the bell of revolution when they sign it, and we take pictures of that, and we display these signatures and these pictures of people ringing the bell who have signed "This I Believe." We display these things to the public for the purpose of letting the public know they're not alone in feeling this way. Well, the Marxists probably don't do that. Well, I know they don't do it, what I just described. I wish they would, but they don't. And the reason they don't is because they don't believe that most people do feel this way. They don't believe that very many people would sign such a statement. And that's why they don't do it.
The original idea, I recall, for the statement was to get people to sign something that we could show to, I had the interest in showing to Marxists and socialists that I knew, and showing them that they were wrong about what they thought ordinary working people wanted and felt. And then it became clear that the real value was showing other people who don't know that they're not alone, that they are in fact not alone. And that's how it developed into a much more effective tactic. Tell us about the strategy of having community discussions, public discussions, and aggressively trying to get those rolling.
Well, we are trying to we've had 2 in the past, and we're presently arranging a 3rd. We're public discussion, get a venue, like a library, public library, or a community center, advertise it with flyers, and hope people show up. We had about 20 people show up the last 2, and we give a short 10-minute talk along the lines that I've just been talking about here, and open up for discussion. We're trying to meet people who want to join us in the effort of helping people see that they're not alone in wanting an egalitarian revolution. The situation now is that it's easy to get people to sign a statement saying we need an egalitarian revolution. This I believe statement. It's easy to get people to sign that. All you have to do is show people the statement in some kind of time and place where they're willing to stop and read it, and most of them will sign it. It's very different to persuade someone to help collect those signatures. To sign it, you simply have to say, well, I agree with that, and sign it. To collect signatures, you have to believe that there's a lot of other people who would sign it, and that therefore it's possible to get a lot of signatures, and then of course you display the signatures and you let people know they're not alone. But most people don't think that there are a lot of other people who would sign it. Most people have been persuaded by the mass media and the institutions of society that if you think we need an egalitarian revolution, then you're a tiny minority. Well, the more signatures we get, the more some people will be persuaded that the majority feel this way, and it makes sense to collect signatures to demonstrate that fact. But at the beginning of the process, it's going to be slow going, which we acknowledge, because when you've only collected this small number of signatures, you don't have as much evidence that it's worth collecting signatures as later on when you've got 1 million signatures. So that's the situation. But one thing that is definitely true is that those who do join in the effort to collect signatures are very pleasantly confirmed in the knowledge that, boy, there's a lot of people out there who want an egalitarian revolution, and it's really important to know that. The ruling class does everything they can to make sure we don't know it. You never see people expressing the desire for egalitarian revolution in television land or radio land, or even really in magazine land, even so-called progressive magazine land. You don't see it there.
That brings us nicely to Occupy, a place where a lot of people might think that you would see it, and so tell us about the nuances of their ideology and how they go about achieving their goal in contrast to how we go about achieving ours.
When Occupy Boston was happening, and there were people camped out at Dewey Square in Boston, I was working at the time, but I went to Dewey Square a lot after work and talked to people. I made a real point of talking to people about these ideas. I took little signs and wrote out a sentence or two to promote conversations along this line. And what I discovered is that in personal conversations, almost everyone agreed with this approach, with these ideas. But in the General Assemblies, these ideas really were not reflected. With a few exceptions, the speeches that were given by speech makers and so forth were not along these lines that I've been discussing here. The big positive thing that the Occupy people did is they identified the problem in the United States as inequality. And it's almost become a cliche in the years since Occupy. But believe me, it wasn't a cliche at all. That no one talked about inequality. It was all identity politics and multiculturalism, this and that, and the 1% versus the 99% was a theme that was hardly ever mentioned. Certainly not mentioned on the mass media. But after Occupy, it even forced the mass media and the politicians to start at least acknowledging that yeah, we got a big problem with economic inequality in this country. So that was the huge positive thing. So that was the positive part of Occupy, but the negative part was that they didn't know what to do after the police removed them from the places where they had their tents and campsites. And I think that a lot of people thought, sort of magical thinking maybe, or just from inexperience or just not having time to figure it out, that if they just could stay in the campsite long enough and do the kind of things that they were doing, which was occasional marches through the city, talking about the 1% versus the 99%, they were just sort of hoping that something good would come of it. And then they got violently thrown out, and what followed that was that they tried to keep meeting, indoors in various venues like schools and community centers. So every month, for a few months after they got thrown out of Dewey Square, they called what they called them General Assembly meetings again, and I went to about 3 of them, and they were not very effective at all, to put it mildly. For some reason, these people, mostly young people in their 20s, they thought that it was necessary to devote like the first 40 minutes of each meeting discussing in great detail the proper way for people to behave in the meeting. Like a kindergarten teacher telling the kids not to interrupt each other and so forth. And it was a little bit absurd, but...
Why do you think that was?
Well, they had somehow absorbed a very negative view of themselves as being people who had to be taught how to behave. That's all I can say.
Where do you think that came from?
Well, I mean, this gets into a whole discussion about the way that the ruling class has made it a point to convince us that you might be a good person, but you're surrounded by bad people. But in either event, I mean, we could pursue that, but...
Well, it has a lot to do with the Marxist view and how Marxism has affected people trying to change the world and make it a better place.
You're right. It's this generally it's an elitist view of people, which unfortunately people themselves have absorbed about themselves, and it's one of the main problems. It's why we're trying to collect signatures on a statement to show people that most people actually are a positive force in the world, not the people are the solution. Ordinary people are the solution, not the problem. But a lot of people have been taught that ordinary people are the problem, and it's a way of controlling people to make people feel hopeless about being able to do anything. It's the very effective way of making sure people don't try to do anything to change things for the better. Well, anyway, the meetings would spend 40 minutes or so, talking about proper behavior, and then no one knew what to talk about. And so people had their own little projects that they maybe had been associated with before Occupy Wall Street, and they would mention them, and eventually they stopped having the Occupy Wall Street General Assembly meetings.
Occupy Boston, you mean specifically?
Yeah, well, this is what happened in Boston, but the same thing I'm sure happened in other parts of the country. And people just sort of fell back into doing the kinds of things that maybe they had been involved with before, or just doing nothing that was particularly political about changing the world. And it basically withered away. And with the exception of Occupy Sandy, which when the hurricane hit, that was a really great emergence of people and sort of under the banner of Occupy, uh, organizing ways for people to help each other on a fairly large scale. It's pretty impressive, actually. But in terms of Occupy Wall Street, it sort of withered away. And partly I think it's because they didn't have a sense of what was the appropriate thing to do, which I think should have been, to reach out to the public in the way that we're trying to do now with People for Democratic Revolution, to let the public know they're not alone in wanting egalitarian revolution. But that idea hadn't been discussed well enough for people to start acting on it in the Occupy context.
So we've looked at the Marxist socialist view of how to achieve an egalitarian classless society and the faults that it has, and we've talked about Occupy having a goal with less formulated means than the Marxist or socialist. But what about the long-term approach of People for Democratic Revolution, the long-term horizontal approach, and tell us about what makes that so different from the Occupy lack of an approach to a degree, and the socialist Marxist firm approach of just getting power of the government and the army as quickly as possible.
Well, our approach is long-term in the sense that we start out by acknowledging that the problem is a big problem, that we have a whole social system that's based on inequality, the capitalist system, pretty much worldwide, and we have almost all the major institutions of society are based on the capitalist inequality as a premise, if not actually enforcing it with coercively. And so it's a big problem. And part of the big problem is that we don't have a democracy. We cannot change fundamental nature of our society, its inequality, by going into a ballot booth and putting a check in a box. No ruling class, like the American plutocracy, which is definitely a ruling class. No ruling class gives up power because of marks in a ballot box. So we acknowledge the bigness of the problem, and we try to be realistic about what it takes to solve that big problem. Well, it takes a major social revolution, a fundamental social revolution. It takes removing the plutocracy from power, not a trivial thing. And so then we work backwards and say, well, okay, what would it take to do that? Well, I don't think it could happen in any other way than if literally hundreds of millions of Americans want it to happen. Not only would it take hundreds of millions of Americans wanting it to happen, but it would take hundreds of millions of Americans knowing that hundreds of millions of Americans want it to happen.
A very important difference.
A very important difference. I think arguably we have the first part, but we don't have the second part today, and there's a big gap between the two. Because when hundreds of millions of Americans know that hundreds of millions of Americans want an egalitarian revolution, then is when you're going to see the formation of big mass organizations. You're going to see people standing up for each other and resisting what the ruling class is doing, and championing the idea that what we ought to have is a society where the ruling class is not in power and we have egalitarianism. And you're going to have people standing up and demonstrating their confidence in one another, which would sometimes take the form of standing up against the police when the police attack people who are engaged in standing up for what's right against the ruling class's policies and so forth. You're going to have a situation where members of the armed forces of the United States are not only going to be like all their friends and families and neighbors wanting an egalitarian revolution, but they're going to see that people are getting pretty determined to do what it takes to stand up against the ruling class. And when soldiers see that there's a revolutionary movement that could actually win if soldiers, go over to the side of the revolutionary movement, refuse to obey orders to attack it, use their weapons to defend it against those who would attack it. When soldiers see that kind of a movement with that kind of support from soldiers can win, they're going to know that it's not such a crazy idea to support it that way. That, yeah, sure, there's a risk that if the movement fails, soldiers who support it would be punished as traitors, but the movement isn't necessarily going to fail. It's too large. I mean, it's large enough so that it has a good chance of succeeding. Well, to create that situation, which can lead to a real revolution, which can open the door for people to have an opportunity to start shaping society by values of equality and mutual aid instead of the capitalist values, to make that happen, you have to have a long-range strategy of helping people to see they're not alone, hundreds of millions of people to see they're not alone in wanting it to happen. There's no get-rich-quick scheme that can work, and the problem is that if you don't, here's the problem that we have, why other people don't pursue the long-range strategy that can actually solve the big problem. If you have a negative view of your fellow citizens, then what I was just spelling out, of course, doesn't make any sense. You're never going to, if people are opposed to egalitarian values, you're not going to persuade them to change their mind on something so fundamental as that. So if you don't think that the approach that I just laid out makes sense, well, what's left? Well, the only thing that's left is to try to persuade some politician to make things better, or to basically you have to engage in wishful thinking, in magical thinking. You have to sort of convince yourself to believe that voting for voting for the latest knight in shining armor politician could solve the problem.
Well, that worked with Obama, didn't it?
Yeah, right. Everyone knows about how that worked out. The famous Dr. Phil saying, "How's that working out for you?" But see, if you can't believe in a realistic solution, you have to sort of persuade yourself to believe in an unrealistic solution. And a lot of people sort of engage in that kind of wishful thinking or magical thinking and try to get excited about get-rich-quick schemes, like, let's have a constitutional convention and decide to make things this way instead of that way. Let's have term limits. Let's buy American. There are all sorts of things kicking around that appeal to this idea that if only we did X, we'd solve the problem. The libertarians are sort of in that, if only we get Ron Paul elected or something, we'd solve the problem. Well, there is no quick fix. And the get-rich-quick schemes basically just appeal to people who don't believe that their fellow citizens are the solution, don't believe in the long-term process of building a revolutionary movement based on that premise, and are looking for some gimmick.
And that's not a value judgment on those people. They just don't have hope and confidence in their neighbors. It's not.
It's the logical thing to do when you think about it. I mean, what else are you going to do? The only alternative to getting excited about a get-rich-quick scheme is to become totally to admit to yourself that the situation is hopeless, nothing can be done, resistance is futile. A very depressing situation. Who wants to live your life that way? So,
you talked about convincing the military, soldiers in the military, as opposed to the top brass, to join the revolution, essentially. Contrast that to the way that the army and soldiers in the army become a part of the revolution in Marxism, because the two have that similarity as you laid them out. But what is the fundamental differences between the way that soldiers involve themselves?
The way Lenin took power in Russia was with a military coup that because the Bolsheviks had support among the garrison soldiers in Petrograd, and the soldiers basically threw out the Kerensky government. It wasn't hard. The Kerensky government was just politicians. They weren't armed, and they took over the government buildings, and the soldiers did what the Bolshevik Party wanted them to do for a time. Of course, the most revolutionary soldiers were in Kronstadt, sailors, and when they started demanding egalitarian things, the Bolsheviks rounded up people from other parts of the country who told them lies about how the soldiers were capitalist roaders and so forth, and led soldiers to attack the sailors in Kronstadt. It was a bloody, violent defeat of the Kronstadt soldiers. So, I mean, the Bolsheviks were able to get soldiers to fight for the Bolsheviks by a combination of lies that soldiers believed, and by the Bolsheviks claiming to be the true revolutionaries and knowing how to get to a classless society and declaring anyone that didn't go along with them to be an enemy of that. That's a long, sordid history, but.
So the difference between so tell us now about how our strategy eventually involves.
The strategy, the difference is it doesn't pertain particularly to soldiers any more than other people. The difference is what are the ideas that are leading the revolution? Are the ideas what I advocate, which is that the ideas be to shape society by the values of equality and mutual aid, and interpreting democracy as voluntary federation of local assemblies of egalitarians, or are the ideas of the revolution going to be the ones that led in Russia with the Bolsheviks, which is Lenin defined the goal of the revolution as being Bolshevik power and the electrification of Russia. In other words, increasing economic productivity and attacking equality, attacking mutual aid, were all considered sometimes absolutely necessary to achieve the goals of the revolution. So the question is, how do people understand the goal of the revolution?
What you're saying is that there's no taking control of the military by taking control of the leadership. There's simply the imploring individuals, soldiers and otherwise, to join the effort however they can.
Well, the idea of military force in a revolutionary sense is the best that people have come up with is what the revolutionaries in the Spanish Revolution, 1936 to 9, came up with when they organized armed militia to defend against the Franco attack on the revolution. So, these were militia that were democratically elected officers. Officers had no special privileges of pay or insignia even, and people joined the militia, agreed to follow military orders so that it could be a militia that could act with military effectiveness. And the goal of the militia was to defend egalitarianism against those who attack it. Well, I think that in a revolutionary situation in the United States, we would ask people who to volunteer to be in such a militia when such a militia is necessary.
Yeah, all right. To close this out, go into a little more detail about the long-term approach in terms of kind of the first year or two, that we're in right now, and the decades and how things really slowly change. The water slowly comes to a boil, and how that all begins. And I just said that we were in the first few years of it, but really the revolution has been going on since almost the dawn of time, and it just continues. So, but tell us about some of that evolution.
You mean you want me to tell you about the future?
Well, not exactly, but what are some of the things that you believe will come to pass one after the other in order to make the next step possible?
I think that this idea that what we need is an egalitarian revolution will spread. God knows it's starting from ground zero in the United States. An example of that is that in 2011, a couple of friends of mine and myself, we attended a lecture by a Marxist professor at Boston College, which is near where I live. And he had just written a book with an analysis of what was wrong with the world and society. And so he gave a talk to about 100 people. And then at the end of his talk, there was a question and answer session. And the audience was all people who were supportive of him, in the sense that, they were against the establishment and agreed that, our society was inequality was wrong and so forth. And so it was a very friendly audience. And so in the question and answer period, a woman said, well, to the professor, well, this is all very fine and good, you've analyzed the problem, but you've described what's wrong, but what do we want? And there was silence. Dead silence. And it went on, it seemed like an eternity of silence. And it became very apparent to me that if this audience is at all representative of disaffected Americans, there's a real, Houston, we have a problem. And the problem is that people can't even say what they want. And as you have said many times, Abram, people don't get on a bus if they don't know where the bus is going. We can't have a movement that really gains steam if it can't even say what it's for. And part of the problem is that for a long time, the people who were saying what the revolution is for were the Marxists, the communist movement, and that became revealed as being very ugly. And so now people are afraid to even say that there should be a revolution for equality, because that whole idea has become so stigmatized by the ugliness of what communists did in its name. But we have to break out of that. we have to start talking about what we really want. And no, it's not, a Communist Party dictatorship with a big central government. It's not socialism where the government is basically thoroughly anti-democratic but claims to be doing everything in the name of the working class. What we want is for people to really be in charge, ordinary working class people with egalitarian values to actually be the ones with the final say, to be able to show up at a meeting in their local community and decide what the law is going to be for that community, with no one above them telling them differently. Although I must say that if there are people who are implementing things that completely go against egalitarianism, if there's a local community where they decided to enslave, all the black people, for instance, or to, increase economic production by making slaves of the children, or, making the children sex slaves or something like that, there's nothing in what I've said or believed that would prevent other people from forcibly preventing those people from doing those bad things, even if it meant, creating a militia, an armed militia, to forcibly with arms to prevent them from doing those things. But in terms of ordinary lawmaking as we think of it, whether to produce this or not, whether to drive on the right side or the left side. In other words, in terms of the things that egalitarians might legitimately disagree about, the principle of democracy should not be that whoever controls the central government tells everyone else what they have to do. The principle should be that people at the local level decide on the laws that community is obliged to follow and that will be enforced in that community, but that no higher body will tell them what laws they have to obey and be enforced. They will come to mutual agreements by method of sending delegates to craft proposals at higher levels. Anyway, the whole question is what are the ideas that people have as a vision for what they want?
And so basically the long-term aspect is simply that it takes a long time to reveal what that vision is, and then to spread the message that...
We're talking about a conversation among millions of people.
It's not going to be quick.
It's not going to be quick. And it's a conversation that the ruling class absolutely does not want to let happen. So obviously, they're going to try to stop it, especially when it gets large and threatening. There's nothing trivial or easy about any of this.
And in Spain, during the Spanish Revolution, the anarchist idea was more or less introduced to Spain, what was it, decades before?
Something like 1870, some anarchists came to Spain and couldn't even speak Spanish. And
he was Italian, right?
Italian, yeah, and by hand gestures somehow communicated the basic idea, and it took off until millions of people were actually calling it, quote, the idea with a capital T and a capital I.
Which I think we should as well.
Maybe we should. And even illiterate Spanish peasants had anarchist books that they carried around with them, and whenever they came upon a person who was literate, they would have them read the book, and they'd memorize passages. And in other words, there was a real intellectual movement that was about an idea, a vision of how things should be. And that's what made it possible for the Spanish Revolution to take place.
It took decades, right?
Yeah.
It's a decades-long conversation, and it's a complicated, big, comprehensive problem. It takes a large, comprehensive solution.
Yeah, there were lots of newspapers that people read or had read to them. There were little meeting places where people would meet and talk and read these things and talk about them. It was a massive spread of an idea.
Well, I think we've answered some questions enough until we get the ones about what we've said today. And people should know that they can contact us and do what we're doing and do other things that are working towards the same goals, and should feel free to do so. And we implore you to do so.
At PDRBoston.org.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Goodbye.